Hello, Librarian Alex, wishing Year 6 and Year 5 Happy New Year. Now, that doesn't mean I don't wish everybody else a Happy New Year, but the story I'm going to read today is only for kids in Year 5 and Year 6. So if you're in Year 4 and below, goodbye, this isn't for you. I'll tell you why. The story I'm going to read means you need to have a bit more life experience, be a bit older to be able to deal with it. So what's the story? It's from this book, Survivors by David Long, and illustrations from Kerry Hyndman. And thank you, Faber Publishers, for letting me read it online. I will read you actually the subtitles. It's got two straplines here. For as long as people have looked for adventure, some have also found danger. All these stories are about dangerous situations. Not just danger, actually. They're mortal situations. The people in them have had to look death in the face. Extraordinary tales from the wild and beyond. So this danger comes from being out in nature where you are at the mercy of natural disasters and events. And all these stories are true. This isn't a fiction book. This is a non-fiction book. But they have a happy ending, all of them, because it's called Survivors. Yes, they confront death, but they live. And that's how we get to hear the tale. Sometimes you can, something maybe to think about is, why do most stories have happy endings in non-fiction and fiction? Well, there may be many reasons, and we all desire hope in our lives. But part of it is that if these stories had the sad endings, the terrible endings, nobody would have returned and told them to us. So this book has about 22 stories in it. I was trying to count them. The reason I have to put my post-it notes on is because it's very peculiar. This non-fiction book doesn't have a contents page. It's the hardback version, and the paperback version does have a contents page. So I've had to write my own, just written it on a scrap of paper here. So I'm going to tell you some of the stories in this book. The girl who fell from the sky. Yep, she fell out of an aeroplane and survived. The woman who sailed into a hurricane. So hurricanes with swirling winds of 100 miles per hour. She did. She sailed into one and survived. The man who sucked blood from a shark. How would you like that for breakfast? It also saved his life. The trapper who grappled with a grizzly bear. The desert runner who drank his own wee. You'd have to be pretty desperate to do that. The couple who were blasted by a volcano, the pilot who crashed inside a volcano, and the woman who froze to death, yet lived. Wow. All of them are extraordinary, but they're not what I'm going to read you today. The one I'm going to read you today, I'm just going to actually give you a little warning. It is really gruesome and quite bloody, and so if you're not into that, turn this video off now. Okay? Right. This story, on the right page, was actually turned into a film because it's one of those life-changing, extraordinary stories. And that's where films find their stories, is in good books like this. Sorry, taking a few minutes. Here it is. It's this one here. Aron Ralston, that's his name. The canyoneer who cut off his own arm. And this happened in U.S.A, in the United States of America, in the state of Colorado, in about 2003. So kind of 18 years ago now. He's about my age now. So this happened to him when he was in his 20s. Yeah. Can you imagine any situation where you would cut your own arm off? Well, you only do it because you're actually trying to save your own life. So let's find out how this happened to him. In the wide open country, of rural North America. The sport of canyoneering involves hiking through wild rocky landscapes, as well as jumping, climbing, scrambling, abseiling, even swimming. And abseiling is that one where you're kind of coming down a rock face on a rope and you kind of jump down with it. Whatever it takes, in other words, to traverse the most challenging terrain the country has to offer. Aron Ralston. He became a mechanical engineer after leaving university. But as a keen outdoorsman, he soon abandoned his career to spend more time in the mountains. In particular, he had a dream to climb what Americans call the Fortiners, a series of nearly 60 mountain peaks in the state of Colorado, each rising to more than 14,000 feet. Now, 14,000 feet is very high. And when you climb higher up, there's two problems. One is it's colder and the air is thinner. So it's a very hard thing to do. So he's set himself the challenge of climbing 60 mountain peaks, which are all over 14,000 feet. Ralston planned to do it climbing alone. And not just that, in the depths of winter. So he's challenging himself to climb these mountains with as little help as possible, i.e. on his own, and at the most challenging time in midwinter. One Saturday in April 2003, he was enjoying a different challenge. One that would have been a lot easier. One that should have been a lot easier. He was spending the day traveling on foot through a remote part of Utah's beautiful Canyonlands National Park. Not for the first time, he was out on his own. But that morning, he made the simple but potentially fatal error of not telling anyone where he was going. Why is that potentially fatal? What's the problem in not telling anyone? Does anyone know where he is? When he doesn't come home, do they know where to look? Ralston figured he would be out for no more than 8 hours, but his troubles began when he attempted to climb down into a particularly narrow slot canyon. As the name suggests, this is a rock crevice which is much deeper than it is wide. Usually this sort of feature forms as the result of erosion when water from a creek or a stream carves its way down through the bedrock. The process can take thousands of years, but the results can be spectacular. Utah boasts more slot canyons than anywhere else in the world. The most impressive are wild and rocky ravines, often 100 feet deep, but no more than 3.5 feet wide from one side to the other. Not surprisingly, they're hugely popular among hikers and mountaineers, both for their beauty and for the excitement they offer the serious climber. So, this is the kind of picture of it. So you've got this kind of thin, deep gap between the rocks, and it's wide enough that you can straddle it with your arms and your feet on either side and gradually inch your way up or down it. But it's very, very deep. So, you could fall. There's a couple of houses deep. Tackling the one known as Blue John Canyon, Ralston was slowly descending by rope when he inadvertently dislodged a huge sandstone boulder. It had been wedged between the canyon walls, but under the force of gravity, it now suddenly shifted downwards. It didn't have far to fall, but when it came to rest, it was crushing. So this sandstone boulder has come down and it's crushing his right hand. Worse, the boulder had pinned his arm against the unforgiving face of rock wall and he was unable to move. So he's unlodged this huge rock, it's fallen on his arm and pinned him against the crevice wall, and that's it. The pain was intense, and Ralston cried out instinctively, "Ah!" But in such a remote place, there was no point in calling for help. In his agony and fury, he shouted and swore repeatedly. But even in his traumatized state, he would have known that the chances of his voice carrying up and out of the deep, narrow canyon was zero. In fact, he could very quickly realize he might die there, trapped in the sheer-sided rocky abyss. Blue John was miles from anywhere, and no one even knew the lone hiker was missing. Yeah, they didn't know he was missing, and they didn't know where he was. And for those of you who might be thinking, oh, well, what about a mobile phone? They don't mention it here, but even if he did have a mobile phone, there wouldn't have been any signal there. And these kind of canyon remote wilderness places, you can't make a call. As far as supplies were concerned, at least he had a little water and a couple of burritos. He knew they had to be rationed, but even if he was lucky enough to be discovered, it might not be any time soon. After 4 days, sorry, can we just pause there? After 4 days, they just put that casually in the text. So he's got his arm trapped. We don't mention day 1, day 2, day 3. We suddenly jump to 4 days later. Day and night he has spent in this canyon with the food that he thought would just last him 1 day trip stretched out over 4. After 4 days, there was no sign of help. He was still trapped, and the water was all gone. No help came the following day either. So we're now into 5 days, and by Thursday, he had no food left. Despite the agonizing injury to his hand, he had made strenuous efforts to move the boulder, but it wouldn't budge, not even slightly. Weighing around 800 pounds, or the same as several grown men, it was impossible to shift no matter how hard Ralston tried pushing with his feet and knees or using an improvised rope cradle. Later, he tried chipping away at the boulder using a MultiTool he carried with him. But after many hours, it had barely made any impression on the diamond-hard surface. So a MultiTool is like a penknife, but with added implements and tools. So you will have knives and maybe a screwdriver and pliers and maybe a mini saw. So it's that kind of tool. The rock was stuck fast, and so was Ralston. He now realised that he needed to consider a more drastic solution. The reasoning was simple enough. If he couldn't move the boulder to free his arm, then he would have to remove his arm to free the rest of his body. It had been done before. 10 years previously, a fisherman in Colorado had cut off his own leg after it became trapped in a rockfall. And a bulldozer driver had done the same thing with a small penknife after he'd been pinned down by a tree. Wow. Incredibly, both men had survived, and done so despite the shock and considerable loss of blood. But a trained surgeon using the best equipment would still think twice before undertaking any kind of self-surgery, and Ralston was a former engineer, not a doctor. All he had was the MultiTool, which was blunted by his efforts to attack the surface of the boulder, and the knowledge that after 5 days stuck under the huge rock, he had no other choice but to try. Well, he has one other choice, and that's to do nothing, and that means accepting that he's going to die. Nobody was coming for him. Nobody knew he was there. So it was either cut off your arm or no, you're going to die. Because of the damage to his MultiTool, Ralston realised he would have to use the smaller of its 2 blades. It was barely 2 inches in length, so it's about like that long. It's a little tiny knife, and far from ideal for the job. Also, Ralston was right-handed. What hand do you use? Left hand or right hand? I'm right-handed. Most people are. So it meant using his left hand, so using his left hand to cut would be even harder. Yeah, have you ever tried writing with your left hand if you're right-handed, or the other way around? You don't have as much skill or dexterity, so he's going to be trying to cut his arm with the hand that doesn't work so well. Nevertheless, with the kind of courage that comes only in the worst situations, he began to cut into his own flesh. Oh. At the same time, he had to staunch the flow of blood by tying a tight band called a tourniquet around his upper arm. All of this with only one hand and regardless of the enormous pain. Now, I'm just going to stop for a second and explain what a tourniquet is, because it might be something that saves your life someday in the future. A tourniquet is the French word for when you tie really tightly something around your body. So what happens is the blood in your body is all pumping around in veins all around your body by your heart. It's moving around so that when you have a cut, you bleed and the veins keep bringing blood to that cut and the blood keeps coming out. One of the things you can do to kind of reduce your loss of blood is to tightly crush the veins before they get to the cut. So you always put something tight between your heart and wherever the cut is. I didn't just realise I don't have a bit of rope. So you need to get a rope, or maybe a belt is a really good thing, or a tie, and you tie it round and you knot it and as hard as you can so that the veins aren't letting the blood flow into the rest of the limb. And this can happen, you know, in London with stabbings, and if people have car accidents, it's a very quick thing that you need to do and it can save someone's life. And Aron knew about that and he knew to do that to himself. So he's put this rope around here so that he will bleed as little as possible as he cuts into his arm. Even more excruciating than cutting through his flesh, however, were the nerves and tendons. The latter, tendons, are the strong sinews which bind together our bones, and they were severed using the tool's built-in pliers. So he's got the pliers, and tendons are almost like really thick, heavy rubber bands, and he'd have to snip them. Ah! But by far the worst part of the operation came when Ralston hit a nerve. Even touching a nerve can cause electrifying pain, but actually severing one sent a bolt of lightning of superheated fire shooting up to his shoulder. Yet the nerves are the bit of our body that express pain and tell our body that we're in pain, and he's just cut them. In all, the operation took around an hour. Imagine that, an hour of hacking away at your own arm. And I've got to say, something they don't mention here, but often comes up when I'm with kids chatting about this book, is he also had to cut through the bone. I mean, that's like tough. I don't know if he had a saw in his MultiTool. I mean, it's like serious cutting. It's horrendous. He spent a whole hour. Each moment, pure agony, until suddenly the impossible was done. Ralston was free. Free of his arm and of the mighty immovable boulder. It was, he later said, the happiest moment of his life. Now, can you imagine that for a moment? It's very perverse, isn't it? It's kind of seems wrong to think that cutting your arm off would be the happiest moment in your life, but at the same time, it was the moment that he knew he'd saved his life. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Think about what's the happiest moment in your life. Yeah, it's all relative, isn't it? Anyway, sorry. He knew he was in desperately urgent need of medical attention and still a long way from home. But mentally, he felt in good shape. The full realization of what he had just done seems to have given him a great sense of personal power. That and knowing he was not going to die alone in the Blue John Canyon. Somehow, with his one remaining arm, he managed to lower himself around 65 feet to the bottom of the narrow rock fissure. Yeah, he's still halfway up. He's still got this giant crevasse below him, which he had to descend and climb with one arm and the other bleeding, or kind of no arm bleeding. And after a long and overdue drink from a filthy, fetid pool of water, I guess because he's run out of water, he's desperately thirsty and weak as well, he began the next part of his journey home. Now, good fortune was on his side. Members of a search and rescue team were out looking for him, having found his truck several miles away. But after so long, they expected to find a corpse. What's a corpse? A dead body. Ralston could certainly see that he was losing blood at a very dangerous rate. But before his battered, dehydrated body gave out for good, he was lucky enough to encounter a young family. They had come thousands of miles from the Netherlands to hike the canyon, and what little food and drinking water they carried, they gladly handed over to the distraught American. In the blistering heat, the mother and son ran ahead to get help, while the father remained behind with the injured man. So think of that. That's a family from Holland on holiday in America, walking through this beautiful scenery, and they suddenly come across this man with his arm chopped off. That's somebody else's story to tell. 2 hours later, and close to collapse, Ralston at last heard the sound of an approaching helicopter. After many months in hospital and a series of painstaking surgeries, his recovery was remarkable. As park rangers laboured to remove the dangerous boulder, in the end it took 13 men, a winch and a powerful hydraulic jack. Wow. He didn't have a hope of moving it. Aron Ralston stuck by his determination to conquer the Fortiners. He did it too in the harsh cold of winter, and became one of only 3 people to have accomplished it while climbing alone. That's the end of his story. Not only did he survive, he went back to climbing, climbed those mountains, those 60 mountain peaks that he had set himself as a challenge, on his own with one arm in winter. And he became one of only 3 men in the world, or 3 people it says, to have ever done it. Wow. A remarkable story of mental fortitude and fearlessness in the face of death. Wow. Now, I hope none of you ever are challenged in that way and have to encounter those kind of decisions in life. But I kind of think we need to acknowledge that last year, 2020, was a hard year. Some people are still facing hard times. It's not been easy. I don't know if you've heard about something called coronavirus. Yeah, it's not just challenged, people's health, but also how people work. Can they go to school? It's changed everything. And all I wanted to say is, as you grow up, you will experience difficult things. It's part of life. But one of the ways of dealing with it is by sharing your story, telling your story. And when you do that, you acknowledge what has happened, you can process what's happened, and maybe you can learn from what's happened, and other people can learn. And that's what these inspiring stories are. I think I might read you a few more over the next few weeks. Take care. I hope you're all very well and that 2021 is being kind to you. Bye.